The whole town laughed when he built it, and now they know why. A retired veteran in a red and black flannel jacket moved to a frozen lake town, betting his last savings on a round metal cabin no one believed could survive winter. Neighbors said the cold would break him, that metal would steal the heat, that his loyal German shepherd would be the first to suffer. But when the temperature plunged to 30 below and the wind began tearing heat out of every home in town, something strange happened. While families burned through their firewood and still froze, smoke barely rose from his chimney. And his dog? Calm, sleeping, warm. What people discovered inside that round cabin would silence every critic, expose a truth about winter survival no one wanted to admit, and permanently change how an entire town built their homes. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter descended on Marquette like an old curse remembered by the body before the mind could name it. Wind from Lake Superior did not move gently through the streets. It struck, sliced, and lingered, carrying cold that felt deliberate, personal, as if the season itself were testing who deserved to remain. On the outskirts of town, where snowdrifts piled higher than fence posts and the lake sky hung low and iron gray, Henry Walker stood beside a structure no one there was willing to call a home. It was round, half buried against the wind, its curved ribs of dull metal rising from a foundation of mortared riverstone. Against the white field of snow, it looked foreign military, improvised, wrong. And because it was wrong, people laughed. Henry Walker was 68 years old, tall but slightly stooped, his frame thinned by age and old injuries rather than weakness. His face was angular, weather-carved, with deep-set eyes the color of cold steel, and a jaw that looked as though it had learned long ago how to clench through pain without complaint. A gray beard, kept short and uneven, framed his mouth and hid a scar along his chin shrapnel, Korea, winter of 1951. His hands were large, scarred, and permanently rough, the hands of a man who trusted tools more than words. He wore the same thing every day, a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, faded at the elbows, heavy enough to stop the wind but flexible enough to work in. It was not a fashion choice. It was armor. At his side sat Bear, a 9-year-old German shepherd with a broad chest and a coat of dark sable streaked with gray. His muzzle had begun to pale with age, but his amber eyes were alert, steady, and intelligent. Bear moved with the quiet discipline of a working dog who had learned routine alongside a man who valued order. He rarely barked without reason. When he did, Henry listened. The laughter drifted over the snow in fragments as neighbors passed on the county road. Some slowed their trucks. Others didn't bother to hide their amusement. A man in a wool cap shook his head openly. "Metal? In Michigan?" Another voice followed, sharper, younger. "That thing's a freezer with delusions." Someone else added, loud enough to carry, "Hope the dog knows how to survive hypothermia." Henry heard it all. He always did. But he did not answer. Arguing required energy better spent elsewhere, and Henry had learned long ago on frozen hillsides half a world away that survival favored those who conserved heat, strength, and words. He bent down instead, resting a gloved hand on Bear's thick neck. The dog leaned subtly into the touch, grounding him. Together, they returned to work. Henry had not come to Marquette chasing nostalgia or peace. He came because the town understood winter, and because he understood winter back. After the war, after the factories, After Sarah died lung illness that took her quietly in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and resignation. Henry learned that silence suited him better than cities. Sarah had been a tall, narrow-shouldered woman with chestnut hair always pulled back too tightly, as if she feared loose strands might betray some inner softness. Her skin had been pale, freckled across the nose, her voice calm and precise. She had believed in preparation, in lists, in doing things correctly the first time. Losing her had hollowed Henry in ways no cold ever could. So when he chose to build, he built with memory, not sentiment. He remembered the Quonset huts from his service curved shells of metal that looked fragile and felt anything but. He remembered how, in bitter Korean winters, those structures held heat more evenly than wooden barracks slapped together in haste. He remembered learning, not from books but from living bodies, that corners trapped cold and flat walls leaked warmth. Geometry, whether men respected it or not, obeyed its own laws. The cabin he built reflected that understanding. 6 inches of packed sawdust mixed with clay lined the interior of the metal shell, binding air into place, stopping movement, stopping loss. Inside that, Henry laid stone riverstone and adobe brick-thick, heavy, deliberate. Not decoration. Storage. Heat, once absorbed, would stay. At the center of the space, not against any wall, he built a compact masonry stove, its flue winding slowly through stone before rising straight up through the curved peak. Every choice served a purpose. Every pound of material had a job. The men who mocked him saw scrap metal and stubbornness. Henry saw systems. Inside the cabin, the air already felt different, even unfinished. Bear sensed it too, choosing to lie near the center, rather than hugging walls like dogs often did in cold places. Henry noticed these things. He always had. War had trained him to watch for patterns others missed. By late afternoon, snow thickened, the sky lowering until it felt as though the world might press itself flat. A pickup truck stopped at the edge of Henry's land. Thomas Reed stepped out, pulling his coat tighter. Thomas was a broad man in his early 50s, thick through the shoulders, his beard flecked with ice. A local contractor, respected, confident, used to being right. His posture carried the easy authority of someone whose opinions were rarely challenged. He didn't approach at first. He stood, hands on hips, evaluating. Finally, he called out, "You really think that thing'll hold?" Henry straightened slowly. "I know it will." Thomas snorted. "Metal sweats. Stone holds cold. You've built yourself a condensation trap." He glanced at Bear. "Dog won't last the winter in there." Bear lifted his head, met Thomas's gaze without aggression, then rested his chin back on his paws. Calm. Unimpressed. Henry said nothing more. He turned back to stacking stone, each piece placed with care. Thomas watched for a moment longer, then shook his head and returned to his truck, the sound of the engine swallowed by wind. As dusk fell, the laughter faded, replaced by the deeper, more dangerous sound of cold settling in. Henry worked until his fingers stiffened despite gloves. When he finally stepped inside, the temperature difference was already noticeable. Not warm yet, but stable. Bear followed, tail brushing the doorway once before Henry sealed it shut. Standing alone in the half-finished cabin, Henry felt something unfamiliar stretch through his chest, not pride, not defiance, but a quiet certainty. He had bet everything on this shape, this idea. His savings were gone. There was no second build, no fallback cabin waiting if this failed. The round walls enclosed him like a held breath. Outside, Marquette waited. Winter always did. And beneath the falling snow, laughter lingered, unaware that it was already beginning to freeze. Henry Walker did not build his cabin out of faith. Faith was fragile, easily shaken by wind, cold, or the opinions of men who believed they had seen everything. He built from memories etched into muscle and bone during winters when mistakes did not cost comfort, but lives. Long before Marquette, long before Lake Superior's merciless wind, Henry had learned what cold truly meant on frozen Korean hillsides, where metal huts curved against the sky like bent backs, and survival depended on understanding space as much as strength. In those years, Henry had been younger, leaner, his face still smooth where scars would later settle. He had learned quickly that cold did not behave evenly. It crept, pooled, and waited. In rectangular barracks, it hid in corners, crawled along seams, settled near the floor like a living thing. Men burned fuel until their eyes stung from smoke, yet still woke shivering. But in the curved huts, those crude military half-cylinders everyone mocked for their ugliness, the air moved differently. Heat did not escape as easily. There were no sharp angles for cold to claim. The shape itself worked, quietly, constantly, without pride. Those lessons followed Henry home, even when the war ended and the world pretended such knowledge was no longer necessary. Now, inside the unfinished cabin outside Marquette, Henry moved with the same deliberate economy he once used cleaning a rifle in the dark. Each action served a purpose. He packed the sawdust and clay insulation by hand, pressing it into place until his shoulders ached, knowing that trapped air was as valuable as fire. The clay bound the mixture, preventing settling, preventing voids. Voids were where cold learned to breathe. Over that, he laid stone. Not decorative stone, not polished or symmetrical, but river stone collected patiently, each piece chosen for weight and density. The wall grew thick, heavy, 8 inches in places, forming what Henry thought of not as a barrier, but as a reservoir. Heat, once earned, should not be allowed to flee. Bear followed him as he worked, padding softly across the packed earth floor, nails clicking faintly on stone. The dog was older now, his joints slower, but his instincts remained sharp. Bear had been with Henry for 9 years, found half-starved behind a hardware store in Duluth during a winter storm. From the beginning, Bear had shown an unusual sensitivity to temperature and space, choosing resting spots that balanced warmth and airflow. When Henry paused to assess his work, he often noticed where Bear lay. If the dog settled calmly, stretched out rather than curled tight, Henry considered it confirmation. That night, with the cabin sealed against the wind, Henry lit the stove for the first time in earnest. The fire was modest, intentionally so. He watched how the heat climbed the curved walls, how it lingered instead of rushing upward. The stone absorbed warmth slowly, like a living thing waking from sleep. Bear lay near the center, head on paws, eyes half closed, breathing steady. The air did not feel hot. It felt stable. Henry sat on an upturned crate, the red and black flannel pulled tight around him, and let his thoughts drift where they often did when he worked alone. He thought of Sarah again, not as she had been at the end, thin and pale against white hospital sheets, but as she was before illness reshaped her. She had been practical to the point of stubbornness, tall and narrow-hipped, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that missed nothing. Her hair, chestnut and heavy, was always braided or pinned back, never loose. Sarah believed in systems, in preparation. in understanding how things worked beneath the surface. She would have approved of this cabin, Henry realized. She would have stood against the laughter not with anger, but with questions sharp enough to expose ignorance. That memory steadied him. The following days brought colder nights and louder commentary. Trucks slowed more often on the road. People stopped pretending not to stare. Some came closer now, curiosity beginning to replace amusement. One afternoon, a woman named Ellen Price walked up while Henry was adjusting the stove flue. Ellen was in her early 40s, broad-shouldered from years of hauling nets and crates at the docks, her dark hair tucked under a wool cap. Her face carried the guarded look of someone used to winter and disappointment in equal measure. She did not laugh. "My husband says you're either a genius or a fool," she said plainly. "He hasn't decided which." Henry wiped his hands on his jeans. "Cold will decide." Ellen nodded once, studying the curved walls. "If this works," she said, "people will talk." "They already are," Henry replied. As January deepened, the first real test arrived not as a dramatic storm, but as a quiet, grinding cold. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there. The wind off the lake strengthened, constant and relentless. Henry noticed changes immediately, not inside his cabin, but beyond it. Smoke from neighboring chimneys thickened. Woodpiles shrank visibly. Men who once waved now passed with eyes averted, too busy calculating how many days of fuel remained. Henry's routine remained unchanged. He fed the stove morning and evening, never rushing, never overloading. The stone walls grew warm to the touch by midweek, holding heat long after the fire settled into coals. At night, Henry slept deeply, waking once only to add a single log, then returning to rest. Bear slept on his side, belly exposed, a sure sign of comfort. One morning, Henry stepped outside to draw water and found Thomas Reed's truck parked nearby. Thomas stood by the door, stamping his boots, beard rimmed with frost. He looked tired now, not skeptical, tired in the way of men who had spent nights feeding fires and still lost ground. "You burning all night?" Thomas asked, trying to sound casual. Henry shook his head. "Not necessary." Thomas glanced past him into the cabin. The warmth escaped briefly, brushing Thomas's face. His eyes flickered, calculating despite himself. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. "Not today," Henry said evenly. "Still finishing." Thomas hesitated, pride warring with curiosity, then nodded. "Cold's just starting," he muttered. "We'll see." As Thomas left, Henry closed the door gently, leaning his forehead against the cool wood for a moment. He felt the weight of what was coming settle fully into his chest. This cabin was no longer an experiment. It was his proof, his shelter, his last reserve. There would be no arguing later if it failed. Only consequences. Outside, the wind rose again, howling across frozen ground. Inside, the stone held steady, the air calm and unmoving. Bear shifted slightly, sighed, and slept on. The old soldier stood in the center of the round space, listening not to the storm, but to the quiet geometry working around him, and understood that winter had begun to choose sides. February arrived without ceremony, the way real danger always does, slipping in quietly before tightening its grip. The temperature dropped to 30 below 0 Celsius and refused to rise, and the wind off Lake Superior turned predatory, blowing day and night with a steady force that stripped warmth from anything careless enough to stand against it. In Marquette, Winter was no longer an inconvenience or a hardship to be endured with humor. It became an adversary that demanded calculation, sacrifice, and sometimes fear. Traditional wooden houses began to fail in familiar, terrifying ways. Back rooms grew unusable first, the cold pooling where fireplaces could not reach. Water froze solid in buckets left too near the walls. Children slept fully clothed in living rooms, curled close to stoves that roared without rest, yet still could not push warmth evenly through square corners and long hallways. Men rose every 2 hours through the night to feed fires, their faces hollowed by exhaustion, their hands cracked and bleeding from splitting frozen logs. Smoke thickened above the town, hanging low and heavy, as if even the air were struggling to escape. Henry Walker noticed these signs not with satisfaction, but with the grim recognition of a man who had seen systems collapse before. Each morning, he stepped outside his round cabin to draw water, the cold biting hard at exposed skin, yet he never rushed. His breath rose in slow, measured clouds. He wore only his thick red and black flannel jacket, buttoned high at the throat, his posture relaxed rather than braced. Bear followed him every time, the German shepherd's paws crunching softly over packed snow, his coat fluffed against the cold, but his body language calm. The dog's age showed now in the stiffness of his hind legs, yet his movements remained sure, his eyes alert. When Bear stopped to sniff the air, Henry waited, trusting instincts refined over years of shared survival. The woodpile beside Henry's cabin told its own quiet story. While others shrank visibly, Henry's remained largely intact, the logs stacked neatly and undisturbed. Inside, the stone walls radiated a steady warmth, not hot enough to dry the air or sting the lungs, but constant, even, forgiving. The stove burned with restraint, its heat absorbed and stored rather than wasted. At night, Henry slept without interruption, waking to find the temperature unchanged, the stone still warm beneath his palm. Bear slept stretched out on his side, belly exposed, a posture no animal would choose if cold lurked nearby. Across the road, Jack Mercer's house was not so fortunate. Jack was a broad-backed man in his late 40s, a former dock worker whose shoulders had been shaped by years of hauling freight. His beard was thick and unkempt now, rimmed with ice most mornings, his temper shortened by cold and fatigue. Jack had built his home 10 years earlier with Thomas Reed's guidance. Thick timber walls chinked carefully with moss and mud, a large stone fireplace anchoring the living room. It had been considered solid, dependable, traditional. By the 5th day of the deep freeze, Jack's family had abandoned 2 bedrooms entirely. Frost bloomed along the interior walls, white and delicate as lace, mocking the fire roaring only feet away. Jack burned through a cord of wood in 4 days and knew, with a tightening in his chest, that he did not have enough cut to last until March. North of Henry's land lived the Petersons, a quiet family with 3 young children. Mrs. Peterson, a slender woman with pale blonde hair perpetually escaping her scarf, kept her kids inside unless absolutely necessary, her voice sharp with anxiety as she rationed both heat and food. The children slept in shifts near the stove, rotating spots closest to the fire, like sailors sharing a single blanket. Their breath fogged the air even indoors. Against this backdrop, Henry's cabin became impossible to ignore. People drove past slowly now, not laughing, not shouting, but watching. They noticed that the smoke from his chimney was thin, almost delicate, drifting upward without urgency. They noticed Henry carrying water without gloves, his movements unhurried. They noticed Bear lingering outside for longer than any dog should in such cold, only returning inside when he chose, not when forced. Rumors shifted tone. At the general store, men spoke in lower voices. Someone said Henry must be freezing himself to prove a point. Someone else suggested he had sealed off parts of the cabin, living in a single heated room. No one suggested anymore that the dog would be the first to suffer. One evening, as the wind reached a sustained howl that rattled windows across town, Thomas Reed stood in his own kitchen, staring at his thermometer with a frown that had settled permanently into his brow. His house, similar in size to Henry's cabin, hovered stubbornly at 48 degrees Fahrenheit, despite constant fire. His wife had retreated to bed early, bundled beneath layers, her face drawn and pale. Thomas pulled on his coat, thick wool and leather, and stepped back into the storm, pride and doubt warring in equal measure. He did not knock this time. He stood outside Henry's door for a long moment, feeling the wind claw at him, listening to the faint, steady silence inside. When Henry opened the door, warmth spilled out. Not a blast, not the suffocating heat of overburned wood, but a rolling, even presence that felt almost alive. Thomas stepped inside before he could second-guess himself. The contrast struck immediately, his glasses fogged, his shoulders loosened. Inside the round cabin, the air felt balanced, unmoving. The stone walls glowed faintly in the lamplight. Bear lifted his head once, acknowledged Thomas, then settled again, unimpressed. Henry closed the door gently and returned to the stove, adding a single split log with practiced ease. Thomas removed his hat slowly, revealing hair flattened by sweat despite the cold outside. His face, usually ruddy from wind and exertion, softened as he looked around. He noticed details he had dismissed before: the absence of drafts, the uniform warmth from floor to ceiling, the lack of condensation on metal or stone. His eyes fell on the thermometer mounted near the center of the cabin. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. "How?" Thomas asked finally, the words stripped of accusation. Henry did not smile. He gestured instead, walking Thomas through the space. He explained the insulation, the thickness, the placement of stone. He spoke of surface area, of curves, of heat storage. His voice remained calm, measured, not instructional, but factual. When Thomas placed his hand against the stone wall, he flinched slightly at the unexpected warmth, not hot, but comforting, steady, like a living body holding on to life. "I haven't fed the fire since early afternoon," Henry said quietly. "Stone's doing the work now." Thomas swallowed. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the cabin remained indifferent to it. The visit did not end with apologies or declarations. Thomas left an hour later, his mind racing, his certainty fractured. He did not speak that night, but the next morning, others came. Ellen Price returned, this time bringing her husband, a narrow-faced man with sharp eyes and a skeptical tilt to his mouth. They stood longer, asked more questions. Jack Mercer drove past twice without stopping, then finally pulled in, his pride exhausted by cold. Henry answered what he could. He refused nothing but exaggeration. He did not claim genius. He did not claim innovation. He claimed only understanding. By the end of the week, Marquette's laughter had vanished completely. In its place stood something heavier, more dangerous to tradition: evidence. The lake wind continued to kill pipes burst. Fires failed, woodpiles emptied, but it passed harmlessly over one round cabin on the edge of town, where an old soldier and his dog lived in quiet defiance of what everyone thought they knew. Henry stood one night at the center of his cabin, listening to the wind batter the curved walls, feeling the stone release its stored warmth slowly, steadily. Bear slept nearby, chest rising and falling in deep, contented rhythm. The test had begun in earnest, and Winter, relentless as ever, was discovering that this time it had met something prepared. The knock came just after dusk, when the wind had reached a pitch that made the walls of most houses creak like tired bones. It was not a polite knock, nor an urgent one, but something in between. A hesitant firmness that suggested a man unaccustomed to asking permission. Henry Walker looked up from the stove, where a modest fire burned low and steady, its warmth already absorbed into the stone around it. Bear lifted his head, ears angling forward, not alarmed but attentive. Henry knew the sound before he reached the door. Thomas Reed stood outside, shoulders hunched against the wind, his thick wool coat dusted white with snow. Up close, the lines on Thomas's face looked deeper than Henry remembered, carved by exhaustion rather than age. His beard was untrimmed, graying unevenly, his eyes rimmed red from too many sleepless nights feeding a fire that never seemed satisfied. Thomas had built half the houses in Marquette, maybe more, and for decades his word on winter survival had gone unchallenged. That authority weighed on him now, pressing inward. Henry opened the door without a word. Warmth spilled out, soft and immediate, wrapping around Thomas's face and hands like a living thing. The contrast was so sudden that Thomas stopped moving, as if struck. His breath caught. He stepped inside almost unconsciously, the wind slamming the door shut behind him as Henry closed it gently, sealing the curve of the cabin once more. Inside, the world changed. The air was calm, unmoving, neither dry nor heavy. The stone walls glowed faintly in the lamplight, their surfaces warm to the touch. The temperature did not spike near the stove or fade toward the edges. It simply existed, evenly, patiently. Bear lay stretched out beside the hearth, chest rising and falling in slow, contented rhythm, his paws relaxed rather than tucked tight against his body. He opened one eye at Thomas's presence, then closed it again, unconcerned. Henry poured coffee from a dented metal pot into 2 thick mugs. He moved without haste, his red and black flannel jacket hanging open now, the sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms marked by old scars and faded tattoos from another life. He handed one mug to Thomas, who accepted it with hands that trembled slightly despite the warmth. Thomas's eyes moved everywhere at once, cataloging details he had dismissed before: the thickness of the interior walls, the absence of drafts, the way the curved ceiling guided heat back down instead of trapping it overhead. His gaze fixed finally on the thermometer mounted near the center of the space. 67 degrees Fahrenheit. "That can't be right," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Henry did not answer immediately. He took a slow sip of coffee, watching the steam rise lazily rather than rush toward the ceiling. "It's been there all day," he said finally. "Hasn't moved more than a degree." Thomas pulled off his gloves, flexing his fingers as sensation returned. "I burned 3 times the wood today," he admitted quietly. "Still couldn't get past 50. My wife, she slept in her coat." The admission cost him something. Pride, perhaps, or certainty. Henry gestured toward the stone wall. "Put your hand there." Thomas hesitated, then pressed his palm flat against the surface. He expected heat, sharp and aggressive. What he felt instead was something else entirely: a steady warmth, deep and reassuring, like a pulse. He left his hand there longer than necessary. "That's the difference, Henry said. "Fire makes heat. Stone keeps it." Thomas turned slowly, his expression no longer skeptical but fractured, as if a belief he had relied on for years had finally given way under pressure. "Metal sweats," he said weakly, repeating the old argument. "Condensation rots everything." Henry nodded. "If you let it. That's why the air moves. Slow, controlled, no trapped moisture. The curve helps. Nothing settles." Thomas noticed then the small vents near the floor on opposite sides of the cabin, subtle and deliberate. He noticed the lack of frost on the windows, the dryness of the air despite the fire. He noticed, most of all, the silence, no whistling drafts, no creaking complaints from overworked timber. They spoke for a long time after that, not arguing, not debating, but measuring. Henry showed him how the stove's flue wound through stone before rising, how each log burned completely before surrendering its heat. He explained surface area, volume, loss. He spoke not as a teacher, but as a man describing something that had saved him before and was doing so again. Later that night, Thomas left without ceremony. He did not apologize. He did not congratulate. He only nodded once, deeply, and stepped back into the wind with a mind that refused to settle. He was not the last. Over the next 3 days, the cabin's door opened again and again. Ellen Price returned with her husband, Mark, a narrow-faced fisherman whose skepticism softened visibly as the warmth reached him. Jack Mercer came, shoulders slumped, his bravado worn thin by sleepless nights. He stood silently near the stove, staring at the thermometer as if it were an insult. Even Mrs. Peterson arrived one afternoon, her children bundled behind her, their eyes wide as they shed layers inside the cabin, cheeks flushing with heat they had not felt in days. With each visit, Henry said less. He answered questions when asked, demonstrated when requested, but he no longer explained himself. The cabin spoke well enough. Words spread beyond curiosity into something heavier: acknowledgement. Men who had mocked the metal shell now studied it quietly. Conversations at the general store changed tone. No one laughed anymore. Laughter required certainty, and certainty had cracked. One evening, after the last visitor left, Henry sat alone with Bear, the fire reduced to glowing coals. He rested his hand on the stone beside him, feeling the warmth continue its slow release. For the first time since winter began, he allowed himself to think beyond survival. He thought of Sarah again, of how she would have stood in this space, one hand on the wall, the other on her hip, eyes sharp with understanding. She would have smiled, not triumphantly, but with the satisfaction of a system proven under stress. Henry felt the familiar ache in his chest, softened now by something close to peace. Outside, the wind continued its assault, howling across frozen ground, stripping heat from every careless surface it touched. Inside the round cabin, the warmth remained, indifferent and steady, a quiet rebuttal to everything the town thought it knew. By opening his door on the coldest nights of the year, Henry Walker had done more than offer shelter. He had let doubt walk inside, warm itself, and leave changed. Winter had not loosened its grip on Marquette, but something else had shifted all the same. And as the lake wind screamed against the curved walls, the old soldier understood that the real test was no longer whether his cabin would hold, but whether the town was ready to accept what it had shown them. The cold eventually loosened its grip, not because it grew kinder, but because even winter has limits. When the temperature finally crept above zero, and the wind from Lake Superior lost its murderous edge. Marquette emerged from February altered in ways that could not be measured by thawing pipes or shrinking snowbanks. The laughter that had once followed Henry Walker's round cabin vanished without ceremony, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous to old beliefs: questions. They came first as glances, then as visits. Men arrived with notebooks instead of jokes, with tape measures instead of folded arms. They circled the cabin slowly, studying its curve, tapping stone, running calloused hands along walls that still radiated warmth days after the fire had gone low. They asked about thickness, about airflow, about the placement of the stove. Henry answered when necessary, but never preached. He had learned long ago that lessons forced upon people were rarely remembered. Lessons survived when discovered the hard way. Thomas Reed returned often during those weeks, not as a skeptic, but as a man quietly dismantling his own certainty. He shaved his beard shorter now, as if shedding something old, and carried himself with a new hesitation that surprised those who had always known him as unshakable. Thomas measured everything twice, then measured again, frowning not in disbelief but concentration. One afternoon, he admitted something aloud that few expected to hear. "I built the same way my father did," he said, voice low, eyes on the stone wall. "Never once asked if there was a better way, just assumed survival meant tradition." Jack Mercer followed, pride finally exhausted. The broad-backed dock worker looked thinner now, his face lined by sleepless nights and quiet worry. He stood inside the cabin longer than anyone else, barely speaking, his hands resting against the warmth, as if afraid it might vanish. When he finally turned to Henry, his voice cracked with something close to relief. "My kids slept through the night here," he said simply. "Didn't wake once." Women came too, cautiously at first. Ellen Price returned with questions sharper than most of the men's, her practical mind already calculating how such a design could be adapted without abandoning what people loved about their homes. Mrs. Peterson came again, this time without her children, her shoulders relaxing as she spoke of sleep reclaimed, of fear receding. Even those who never set foot inside the cabin felt its influence. Conversations shifted at the general store. Arguments softened. Certainty gave way to curiosity. By spring, the change became visible. The first adaptation rose on the edge of town, not round but softened, its sharp corners replaced by gentle curves, its fireplace rebuilt with heavier stone. The builder was a quiet man named Robert Hayes, a former railroad worker with a narrow face and perpetually furrowed brow. He lacked Henry's confidence and Thomas's reputation, but he possessed something just as important: willingness. He asked Henry questions, not to copy, but to understand. Henry walked him through principles rather than instructions. "Keep the heat," he said. "Don't chase it." More followed. Some used curved metal frames clad in wood to satisfy tradition's eye. Others built thick interior stone walls within rectangular shells, borrowing what mattered most and discarding the rest. The shapes varied, but the results did not. Wood piles shrank more slowly. Nights grew quieter. Fires burned lower and longer. Henry watched it all with detached acceptance. He did not take credit. He did not attend meetings or offer lectures. He continued his routines as before, rising early, feeding the stove sparingly, walking bare along the frozen shoreline as spring struggled to assert itself. The German shepherd aged visibly now, his muzzle almost fully gray, his gait slower, but his presence steady. He moved beside Henry as he always had, two survivors bound by shared winters and mutual trust. On one such walk, as the lake ice cracked and groaned beneath a pale March sun, Henry thought again of Sarah. He imagined her standing at the window of the round cabin, sunlight catching in her carefully pinned hair, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. She would not have celebrated victory. She would have noted efficiency, improvement, the quiet satisfaction of something working as intended. Henry smiled faintly at the thought, the ache in his chest softened by time and purpose. By the following winter, Marquette looked subtly different. Not transformed, not reborn, but adjusted. Curves appeared where none had existed before. Stone became heavier, insulation thicker. Even Thomas Reed incorporated what he now called modern mountain principles into his work, though he never mentioned Henry's name unless asked. When he did, he spoke with respect rather than pride. He didn't fight tradition, Thomas said once. He just understood winter better than most of us. Henry Walker never became famous. He never left Marquette for speaking engagements or interviews. When asked why, he shrugged. "Cold doesn't care who you are," he said, "only whether you prepared." Years passed. Bear eventually slowed to a careful walk, then to a gentle limp. Until one winter morning, he did not rise at all. Henry buried him beneath a stand of pines, the ground softened by a rare early thaw. He stood there a long time afterward, flannel jacket pulled tight, listening to the wind move through branches rather than batter walls. That night, the cabin held its warmth as it always had, but the space felt larger, quieter. Henry placed Bear's collar by the stove, where the stone would keep it warm. Life continued, reshaped but familiar. When newcomers arrived in Marquette and asked about the odd round cabin on the edge of town, no one laughed anymore. They explained instead. They spoke of winters that killed carelessness, of a man who trusted geometry over habit, of a house that taught a town to ask better questions. And Henry, walking slowly through falling snow in his red and black flannel, accepted it all without comment. Sometimes, the old soldier did not oppose tradition at all. He simply saw a way to survive it. In the end, this story was never really about a cabin, or even about winter. It was about the quiet miracles that happen when a person listens more closely than they speak, trusts wisdom over habit, and prepares instead of panicking. Some people call that intelligence. Some call it experience. Others call it faith. And maybe faith doesn't always look like praying for the cold to go away. Maybe sometimes faith looks like building wisely before the storm arrives, believing that God gives us not only hope, but understanding, patience, and the ability to learn. The warmth that saved Henry Walker was not magic, but the timing, the endurance, the way one man's quiet choices ended up protecting many others, that feels very close to a miracle. In everyday life, we face our own winters: financial stress, loneliness, illness, fear of the future. We can burn ourselves out trying to fight those storms the old way, or we can pause, think, and build something stronger inside. Sometimes God doesn't remove the storm. Sometimes He teaches us how to stand in it without freezing. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of a hard season you survived, or one you're still walking through, please share it with someone who might need a little warmth today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what winter, literal or personal, you've had to endure. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so these stories can keep reaching people who need them. May God bless you, keep you safe, and give you wisdom for every season ahead. And may your home, your heart, and your life stay warm, no matter how strong the wind outside may be.